I've been married for 23 years and thought I was living a perfect life. Until I cleaned out the attic and found 4 letters that shattered everything I believed in. These letters revealed the shocking truth about who we've become after 20 years of marriage. But before I tell you what was written in these letters, subscribe to our channel and join this community. It may seem like just a click, but for us, it's fuel to continue finding and sharing these incredible stories. Now, the first letter began with something that made my hands tremble. Cleaning out the attic wasn't supposed to change my life. I was just making room for Michael's golf clubs, the ones he insisted on storing up there despite having a perfectly good garage. 23 years of marriage had taught me to pick my battles, and golf club storage wasn't worth the fight. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the small window, and I found myself thinking about how quiet the house had become since our youngest left for college. That's when I saw it, a small wooden box tucked behind old Christmas decorations, with my maiden name carved into the lid. I hadn't seen that box in decades, hadn't even remembered it existed. My heart did something strange as I pulled it toward me, something between a skip and a stumble. The brass latch was tarnished but still worked. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were 4 letters addressed to future Claire. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, but younger, more confident somehow. The loops were bigger, the pressure heavier, like the person who wrote them believed every word mattered. I remembered now. I'd written these during my last week as a single woman, sitting in my tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, surrounded by wedding boxes and dreams. Back then, I'd thought I was so clever, so wise beyond my 25 years. I was going to be different from other wives, other women who lost themselves in marriage. I was going to keep my promises to myself. But as I held those letters in my 57-year-old hands, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The first envelope was marked, "Open on your 5th anniversary." The second, "Open on your 10th anniversary." The third and fourth were labeled for the 15th and 20th anniversaries, respectively. We'd celebrated our 23rd anniversary 3 months ago with dinner at the same restaurant we'd been going to for the past decade. Safe, predictable, boring. Michael had given me earrings, beautiful ones, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd worn earrings anywhere worth noticing. I'd given him a watch, and we'd both smiled and said the right things. But something felt hollow about it all. Now, sitting cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, I realized I'd completely forgotten about these letters. The woman who wrote them felt like a stranger, someone I might have known once but had lost touch with years ago. My hands trembled as I opened the first letter. The paper crackled softly, and I could smell the faint scent of the vanilla perfume I used to wear. "Dear future Claire," it began. "If you're reading this, you've been married to Michael for 5 wonderful years. I'm writing this to remind you of the promises you made to yourself, the ones that matter more than any wedding vow, because I know how easy it is to forget who you are when you're busy becoming who everyone else needs you to be." The words hit me like a physical blow. This younger version of myself had been so certain, so protective of her future self. She'd known, somehow, that she was in danger of disappearing, and she'd tried to save me from it. But I was reading this letter 18 years too late. "Promise number 1, the letter continued. "Never lose your identity. You are Claire Elizabeth Martinez, artist, dreamer, woman who believes in magic. You are not just Michael's wife or someone's mother. You have your own light, your own fire. Don't let anyone, not even Michael, especially not yourself, dim that light. Keep painting, keep creating, keep being the woman who sees beauty where others see ordinary. This is your most sacred promise." I had to stop reading. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. When was the last time I'd touched a paintbrush? When had I stopped calling myself an artist? The easel in the basement had been folded up and shoved behind the water heater for at least 10 years. I couldn't even remember making the decision to stop. It had just happened. The silence in the attic was deafening. Downstairs, I could hear Michael watching his evening news, the familiar cadence of the anchor's voice drifting up through the floorboards. Normal life continuing while my world was quietly imploding. I looked around at the stored remnants of our life together. Christmas decorations we'd accumulated over the years, boxes of our children's artwork and school projects, photo albums from family vacations where we all smiled on command. Everything spoke of a life lived for others, a life carefully curated for approval and acceptability. But where was I in all of it? Where was the woman who'd been so fierce about protecting her authentic self? She'd vanished so gradually that I hadn't even noticed her leaving. And now, all I had left of her were these 4 letters and the growing certainty that I'd broken every promise I'd ever made to myself. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting on the hard floor for so long. The other 3 letters felt heavy in my hands, weighted with accusations I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but I knew I had to read them all. I owed that much to the young woman who'd been wise enough to write them, and to the middle-aged woman who'd been foolish enough to forget them. As I climbed down from the attic, clutching the letters to my chest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of anticipation mixed with dread. Whatever these letters revealed about the promises I'd broken, whatever truths they forced me to confront, there was no going back to the comfortable numbness I'd been living in. The woman I used to be had just reached across 23 years to shake me awake. And whether I liked it or not, I was finally ready to listen. I couldn't sleep that night. Michael snored softly beside me. The same steady rhythm that had once comforted me but now felt like a metronome counting out the years of my complacency. The 3 unopened letters lay in my nightstand drawer, and I could feel their presence like a weight on my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that young woman's handwriting, so confident and sure. She'd believed in tomorrow, believed in her ability to stay true to herself no matter what life threw at her. She'd been so naive, so impossibly optimistic. Part of me wanted to hate her for that optimism, for not understanding how life wears you down in ways you don't even notice until it's too late. But mostly, I felt a grief so profound it scared me. Grief for the woman I'd been, for the dreams I'd buried so completely I'd forgotten they existed. At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and crept downstairs to the kitchen. The second letter sat before me on the kitchen table, and I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The coffee maker gurgled in the background, filling the silence with its familiar sounds. But everything felt different now, like I was seeing my own life through a stranger's eyes. "Dear future Claire," this letter began, "it's your 10th anniversary. I hope you're celebrating somewhere amazing, somewhere that makes your artist's heart sing. I hope you've had shows by now, sold paintings, made people feel something beautiful. But if you haven't, if life has pulled you away from your art, please remember this. Creating isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's who you are." I set the letter down and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban neighborhood that had become my entire world. When had I started seeing safety as more important than dreams? When had I convinced myself that wanting more was ungrateful? Promise number 2. The letter continued when I returned to the table. Always prioritize your dreams, not over family, alongside family. Show your children what it looks like to be a woman who pursues her passions. Show Michael what it means to be married to someone who's fully alive. Don't you dare shrink yourself to fit into someone else's idea of what a wife and mother should be. The words cut deep because I knew exactly when I'd started shrinking. It hadn't been dramatic or sudden. First, I'd skipped one art class because the baby was teething. Then I'd sold my easel to make room for a changing table. I'd told myself it was temporary, just until the kids were older. But temporary had become years, and years had become decades. I'd become an expert at making excuses that sounded noble and self-sacrificing, when really they were just fear dressed up as virtue. I remembered the exact moment I'd stopped calling myself an artist. At a dinner party about 15 years ago, someone had asked what I did, and I'd started to say, "I'm a painter." But Michael had jumped in with Claire's a full-time mom. He'd said it with such pride, such certainty, that I'd smiled and nodded along. Later, when I'd brought it up, he'd looked confused. "But you don't really paint anymore," he'd said. Not unkindly, just matter-of-factly. And he'd been right. I hadn't painted in months at that point. But hearing him say it out loud had felt like a small death, like watching someone erase you while you stood there smiling. From that day forward, when people asked what I did, I said, "I'm a mom," or "I manage the household," or eventually just, "I'm Michael's wife." Each time, I felt myself disappearing a little more. The worst part wasn't that Michael had discouraged my art. He hadn't. Not really. The worst part was that I'd done it to myself, made the choice to step back, to make space for everyone else's needs and dreams while quietly suffocating my own. I'd told myself it was noble, that good mothers sacrifice for their families. But this letter from my younger self was holding up a mirror I didn't want to look into. "You're not just a support system for other people's lives," 25-year-old Claire had written. "You're the protagonist of your own story. Don't you dare spend your whole life as someone else's side character." The truth of those words hit me like a physical blow. When had I become a side character in my own life? When had I started believing that my dreams mattered less than everyone else's comfort? I made more coffee and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly passionate about anything. Not the mild contentment that came with a clean house or a successful dinner party, but real passion, the kind that makes your hands shake and your heart race, the kind I used to feel when I stood in front of a blank canvas, when I mixed colors and watched them become something alive and electric. I couldn't remember. That realization sat in my chest like a stone. I'd become so good at being grateful for what I had that I'd forgotten to mourn what I'd lost. So good at being the perfect wife and mother that I'd forgotten to be myself. The woman who'd written these letters had seen this coming, had tried to warn me, and I'd ignored every signal, every alarm bell, until the woman I'd been was just a ghost haunting my perfectly organized life. Michael appeared in the doorway, rumpled and confused. "Claire? What are you doing up?" He looked genuinely concerned, and I felt a pang of guilt for the resentment that had been building in my chest. This wasn't his fault, not entirely. He'd married an artist, a vibrant woman with plans and dreams, and I'd slowly transformed myself into someone else without ever discussing it with him. I'd assumed he preferred this version of me, the one who had dinner ready at 6 and never complained about anything. But looking at him now, I wondered if he missed the woman I used to be as much as I did. "Just couldn't sleep," I said, folding the letter. But that was a lie. I was wide awake for the first time in years, and I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The third letter waited until Saturday morning, when Michael left for his golf game and the house fell into its weekend silence. I'd been carrying it around for 2 days, feeling its weight in my purse, against my hip, like a small paper heart beating against my ribs. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows differently somehow, sharper, more insistent, as if even the sun was demanding I pay attention. I poured my coffee slowly, deliberately, like a ritual. Because that's what this was becoming. A ceremony of remembering, of excavating the woman I used to be from beneath decades of careful compromise. The letter felt warm in my hands, though that was probably just my imagination. 25-year-old Claire had been so careful with these letters, so certain that future me would need them. She'd been right about everything so far. I was almost afraid to see what else she'd predicted. "Dear future Claire," the third letter began, "Happy 15th anniversary. I'm writing this on a dare to yourself. Do you remember? You promised you'd never become one of those women who stops taking risks, who chooses comfort over adventure every single time. You said you'd rather fail spectacularly than succeed quietly. Please tell me you've kept that fire alive." I had to laugh, though it came out bitter. The only risks I'd taken in the past 15 years were trying new recipes for dinner parties and occasionally buying clothes without checking the price tag first. My life had become a masterpiece of careful choices, calculated decisions designed to keep everyone comfortable and nothing ever uncertain. When had uncertainty become my enemy instead of my friend? When had I started seeing adventure as irresponsible rather than essential? Promise number 3, the letter continued. Never stop being brave. Take the art classes in Paris you've always talked about. Submit your work to galleries, even if they reject you. Travel to places that scare you and excite you in equal measure. Say yes to invitations that make your heart race. Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling the fear and choosing to live fully anyway. I set the letter down and walked to the refrigerator, where our family calendar hung like a roadmap of obligation. Every square was filled with safe, predictable activities, dentist appointments, school events, Michael's work functions, neighborhood book club meetings where we discussed books chosen for their inoffensiveness rather than their power to change us. Where was the space for spontaneity? For the kind of yes that might change everything? I couldn't remember the last time I'd said yes to something that genuinely scared me. The irony was devastating. I'd married Michael partly because he was safe, reliable, steady, unlikely to break my heart or drag me into chaos. After a series of relationships with artists and musicians who were passionate but unstable, Michael had felt like coming home. He was going to be a doctor, had plans and stability, and a 5-year vision that included me. I'd thought I was being smart, choosing security over uncertainty, but I'd never meant to choose safety over everything else. Never meant to build a life so cushioned against risk that it couldn't accommodate dreams. I'd thought I could have both, security and adventure, stability and passion, but somewhere along the way, I'd let security win every battle until it had won the war entirely. The woman I'd been, the one who backpacked through Europe alone, who submitted paintings to shows she had no business entering, she'd been replaced by someone who needed 3 opinions before changing her hairstyle. I called my sister Emma, something I rarely did on weekend mornings. "Claire?" she answered, surprised. "Everything okay?" Emma was 2 years younger but had always seemed older in the ways that mattered. She'd never married, traveled constantly for her job in international development, sent postcards from places I couldn't pronounce. I'd always envied her freedom while simultaneously judging it as selfish. Now I wondered if she'd been the wise one all along. I said, surprised by how shaky my voice sounded. When was the last time I did something that scared me? There was a long pause. Then she said, very gently, "Claire, honey, when was the last time you did anything at all?" The question hung between us like a challenge. "I've been thinking the same thing lately," she added. "You've been so careful. For so long. I keep waiting for you to surprise me again, like you used to." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "Remember when you moved to New York with $500 and a suitcase full of art supplies? Remember when you entered that show at the Whitney even though you were nobody? You were fearless, Claire. You were electric. I used to be jealous of how alive you were." Her words hit me like cold water. Emma had been jealous of me. I'd spent years being jealous of her freedom, her adventures, her willingness to live without a safety net. But she'd been missing the woman I used to be, the woman I'd traded away for security and approval. "I don't know how to be that person anymore," I admitted. "I don't even know if she still exists." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why don't you find out? What's the worst that could happen? You remember you're amazing." After we hung up, I sat staring at the letter again, at that confident handwriting that belonged to a woman who believed in possibility. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, empty and full of potential in a way that felt foreign. Michael wouldn't be back for hours. I could do anything. Drive somewhere I'd never been. Sign up for that pottery class I'd been thinking about for 3 years. Book a trip to somewhere that scared me. The freedom was dizzying and terrifying. For so long, my days had been filled with obligations and other people's needs that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have time that belonged entirely to me. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box, but its words echoed in my head. Never stop being brave. The woman who'd written that had believed I was capable of courage. Maybe it was time to find out if she'd been right. Maybe it was time to scare myself a little, to remember what it felt like to say yes to something bigger than the life I'd been settling for. The fourth letter could wait. I had some living to catch up on first. 2 weeks passed before I opened the fourth letter. 2 weeks of small rebellions that felt like earthquakes in my carefully ordered world. I'd signed up for a painting class at the community college, just one night a week. But Michael had looked at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. I'd driven to the coast alone on a Tuesday, something I'd never done, and stood on the cliffs watching the waves crash until my fingers were numb with cold, and my heart was warm with something I'd almost forgotten. The simple pleasure of being exactly where I wanted to be. I'd even submitted 3 old paintings to a local gallery's open call, though my hands had shaken so badly while filling out the application that I could barely write my name. Each small act of rebellion felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever. But with each step toward the woman I used to be, the distance between Michael and me seemed to grow wider. The final letter felt different in my hands, heavier somehow, though that was impossible. I'd saved it for a Sunday morning when Michael was at his mother's, when I could read it without the weight of his confusion pressing down on me. He'd been watching me differently lately, like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You seem different, he'd said the night before, and I'd heard the worry in his voice. Different how? I'd wanted to ask. Different like I'm becoming myself again. Different like I'm remembering I used to have opinions and dreams. But I'd just smiled and said I was fine, because that's what I'd been trained to do. Smooth over any rough edges, make everyone comfortable, be the perfect wife who never caused waves. But I was tired of being fine when I felt like I was dying inside. "A dear future Claire," the last letter began. "If you're reading this, you've been married to Michael for 20 wonderful years. God, that seems like forever from where I'm sitting. But I'm not writing to congratulate you on lasting so long. I'm writing to ask you the hardest question of all. Are you still you? Not the version of you that makes everyone else comfortable, but the real you, messy, complicated, authentic you." My hands started shaking before I'd even finished the first paragraph. This letter knew me too well, had anticipated the exact compromise I'd made with myself. I'd spent so many years being the version of Claire that everyone else needed that I'd almost convinced myself that person was the real me. But sitting there with that letter, I felt the facade cracking, felt the real me underneath struggling to breathe. "Promise number 4, the letter continued. Always speak your truth. Don't smooth over your rough edges to make other people comfortable. Don't edit yourself to fit into spaces that are too small for your soul. Marriage should make you more yourself, not less. If you're reading this and you've become someone you don't recognize, if you've been quiet when you wanted to scream, agreeable when you wanted to fight, please remember, you are not responsible for managing everyone else's feelings at the expense of your own." I had to put the letter down. The words were too accurate, too devastating. When had I become so afraid of conflict that I'd chosen silence over honesty? When had I started believing that being a good wife meant never disagreeing, never wanting something different, never being inconvenient? I'd become an expert at swallowing my own needs, at convincing myself that what I wanted didn't matter as much as keeping the peace. Michael's key turned in the front door, and I quickly folded the letter, but not quickly enough. He found me in the kitchen with tears on my cheeks and questions in my eyes that I could no longer hide. "Claire?" His voice was gentle but wary. "What's wrong? You've been—" I don't know how to say this without sounding awful, but you've been different for weeks. Restless. Like you're looking for something I can't give you. His honesty caught me off guard. He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. We'd been married for 23 years. But instead of asking what I needed, he'd been waiting for me to go back to normal, to stop being inconvenient. That realization hit me like a physical blow. Even Michael, who loved me, expected me to manage my own transformation quietly, to figure it out without disturbing his comfort. The letter was right. I'd trained everyone around me to expect my silence. "I found some letters," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Letters I wrote to myself before we got married. Promises I made about who I'd stay, what I wouldn't give up." Michael sat down across from me, and I could see him trying to understand, trying to be supportive, but also trying to figure out how to fix this, how to get back to the comfortable life we'd built. "What kind of promises?" he asked carefully. So I told him. About the art, about the dreams I'd buried, about the woman I'd been who was brave and passionate and inconvenient, about how I'd slowly erased myself to become the wife I thought he wanted, the mother I thought our children needed. With each word, I watched his face change from confusion to hurt, to something that looked almost like relief. "You never told me you felt this way," he said finally. "I thought you were happy. I thought this was what you wanted." "I thought it was too," I admitted. "But I think I confused being grateful with being happy. I think I convinced myself that wanting more than this perfect life we built made me selfish." Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this information that threatened to rewrite everything he thought he knew about our marriage. Finally, he said, "So what do you want to do about it?" It was such a simple question, but it felt revolutionary. After decades of considering everyone else's needs first, someone was asking what I wanted. The answer scared me because it was so huge, so late, so potentially devastating to the life we'd built together. "I want to remember who I am," I said. "I want to paint again. I want to travel. I want to stop being afraid of disappointing people." I looked at him across the table, this man I'd loved for so long, and added the hardest truth of all. "I want to find out if the woman I used to be can love the man you've become, and if the man you are now can love who I'm trying to become again." 6 months later, I stood in front of my first solo show in 25 years, wearing a dress that actually reflected my personality instead of my desire to blend in, watching strangers connect with paintings that had poured out of me like water breaking through a dam. The gallery was small, local, nothing like the grand exhibitions I'd dreamed of in my 20s, but it was mine. Each piece told the story of a woman remembering herself, abstract landscapes that captured the feeling of being lost, portraits that explored the masks we wear, and one large canvas that I'd titled Letters to Myself that somehow contained all the grief and joy and terror of the past year. Michael stood beside me, nervous but proud, still adjusting to this version of his wife who had opinions about lighting and actually disagreed with him when he suggested we serve white wine instead of red at the opening. We were learning to love each other again, but differently this time, as two complete people choosing each other rather than two half-people trying to become whole through marriage. The hardest part hadn't been rediscovering my art or my courage. It had been learning to disappoint people gracefully. I'd stepped down from 3 committees that I'd only joined out of obligation. I'd stopped hosting dinner parties that stressed me out for weeks beforehand. I'd said no to requests that would have required me to betray my own needs for other people's convenience. Each no felt like a small revolution, like reclaiming territory I'd given away without realizing its value. My children, now adults, had been confused at first by this mother who suddenly had boundaries and dreams of her own. "Mom's going through something," I'd overheard my daughter telling her brother, as if my newfound aliveness was a phase I'd get over. But gradually, they'd started to see me as a person instead of just a mother, and our relationships had deepened in ways that surprised us all. Turns out, children respect parents who model authentic living more than they respect parents who sacrifice everything. Emma had been right. I'd needed to scare myself. The painting class had led to weekend workshops, which had led to applying for a summer residency program in Tuscany that I would have considered impossible a year ago. Michael and I had fought about it. our first real fight in years. But for the first time, I hadn't backed down just to keep the peace. "This isn't about you," I'd told him when he'd accused me of being selfish. "This is about me remembering that I exist independently of your comfort level." He'd been hurt, but he'd also seemed relieved to finally be fighting with a real person instead of the agreeable ghost I'd become. We'd worked through it, negotiated like two adults with different needs, rather than a husband making decisions and a wife accommodating them. I was going to Italy for 6 weeks this summer. The thought still made my hands shake, but with excitement now instead of fear. The gallery opening was winding down when a woman about my age approached, her eyes bright with something I recognized, the look of someone seeing possibility where they'd only seen limitation before. Excuse me," she said. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how old are you?" When I told her 57, she smiled like I'd given her permission for something. "I'm 54, she said. "I've been telling myself it's too late to start over, too late to go back to photography. But seeing your work, seeing you here?" She gestured around the gallery. "Maybe it's not too late after all." I thought about the letters, about 25-year-old Claire's fierce belief that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. "It's never too late," I told her, meaning it with every cell in my body. Scared is not the same as too late. Scared just means it matters. She bought 3 photographs she'd apparently been hiding in her closet for 15 years, and left with my card and something I recognized as hope. Driving home, Michael reached over and took my hand, not the automatic gesture of long marriage, but a deliberate choice to connect with this new version of me. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just the art, but all of it. The way you fought to become yourself again. It's been hard, but it's been amazing to watch." I squeezed his hand, grateful for this man who'd been brave enough to love me through transformation instead of insisting I stay safely the same. We'd both had to grow into this new version of our marriage, had to learn that love isn't about keeping someone safely contained, but about supporting them as they become fully themselves. It hadn't been easy. There had been tears and arguments and moments when we'd both wondered if we were destroying something good in pursuit of something real. But we'd chosen growth over comfort, truth over peace, and somehow found our way to something deeper than we'd had before. At home, I sat in my studio, the spare bedroom we'd converted when I'd finally admitted that my art needed space in our house, and pulled out the box of letters one more time. I had a new letter to write now, one to future Claire, the one who would be 67, 77, 87. What promises did I want to make to her? What wisdom could I pass forward? "Dear future Claire," I began, "I hope you're still painting, still taking risks, still choosing authenticity over approval. I hope you never again confuse being grateful with being passive or mistake settling for wisdom. Remember, you are not too old, too late, or too anything to become who you're meant to be." I sealed the letter in an envelope marked, "Open when you think it's too late to change," and placed it in the box with the others. 25-year-old Claire had saved me. Maybe 57-year-old Claire could save someone too. The house was quiet around me, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of suppression, but the peace of alignment. Outside my studio window, I could see the easel Michael had bought me for my birthday, set up in the garden where I liked to paint in the mornings when the light was just right. Tomorrow I would stand in front of a blank canvas again, and I would have no idea what would emerge, what truth would demand to be told. The uncertainty that used to terrify me now felt like freedom. I was 57 years old, and I was finally, completely, authentically alive. If you've been married 20 years or more, if you've felt yourself disappearing in the comfortable safety of commitment, if you've forgotten the promises you made to yourself before you made promises to anyone else, it's not too late. It's never too late to become yourself again. I am living proof that the woman you used to be is still in there, waiting for permission to breathe. Give her that permission. The world needs who you really are. If Claire's journey of rediscovery resonated with you, please click like And subscribe to Revenge Yasa. Your support fuels these incredible stories. Leave a comment and tell us, what promises have you broken to yourself? We want to hear your story, but if you think finding forgotten letters is shocking, wait until you hear about the 56-year-old librarian who discovered her husband was stealing her retirement money to video chat with his 28-year-old girlfriend. She didn't confront him, but you'll be shocked by what she did.